This tale was suggested by the reading of The Voyages and Travels of Sir John Maundeville, in which the fantastic realm of Abaz and the darkness-covered province of Hannison are actually described. I recommend this colorful 14th-century book to lovers of fantasy. Sir John even tells in one chapter how diamonds propagate themselves. Truly, the world was a wonderful place in those times, when almost everyone believed in the verity of such marvels. Now in his journey, Sir John Maundeville bade passed well to one side of that remarkable province in the kingdom of Abaz which was called Hannison, and, unless he was greatly deceived by those of whom he had inquired the way, could deem himself within 2 days' travel of that neighboring realm of Georgia. He had seen the river that flowed out from Hannison, a land of hostile idolaters on which there lay the curse of perpetual darkness, and wherein it was told the voices of people, the crowing of cocks, and the neighing of horses had sometimes been heard by those who approached its confines. But he had not paused to investigate the verity of these marvels, since the direct route of his journey was through another region. And also Hannison was a place which no man, not even the most hardy, would care to enter without need. However, as he pursued his wayfaring with the 2 Armenian Christians who formed his retinue, he began to hear from the inhabitants of that portion of Abaz the rumor of an equally dread domain named Anchar lying before him on the road to Georgia. The tales they told were both vague and frightful, and were of varying import. Some said that this country was a desolation peopled only by the liches of the dead and by loathly phantoms. Others, that it was subject to the ghouls and afrits, who devoured the dead and would suffer no living mortal to trespass upon their dominions. And still others spoke of things all too hideous to be described, and of dire necromancies that prevailed even as the might of emperors doth prevail in more usually ordered lands. And the tales agreed only in this, that Anchar had been within mortal memory one of the fairest domains of Abaz, but had been utterly laid waste by an unknown pestilence, so that its high cities and broad fields were long since abandoned to the desert, and to such devils and other creatures as inhabit waste places. And the tellers of the tales agreed in warning Sir John to avoid this region, and to take the road which ran deviously to the north of Anchar. For Anchar was a place into which no man had gone in latter times. The good knight listened gravely to all these, as was his wont, but being a stout Christian, and valorous withal, he would not suffer them to deter him from his purpose. Even when the last inhabited village had been left behind, and he came to the division of the ways, and saw verily that the highway into Anchar had not been trodden by man or beast for generations, he refused to change his intention but rode forward stoutly while the Armenians followed with much protest and trepidation. Howbeit, he was not blind to the sundry disagreeable tokens that began to declare themselves along the way. There were neither trees, herbs nor lichens anywhere, such as would grow in any wholesome land, but low hills mottled with a leprosy of salt, and ridges bare as the bones of the dead. Anon he came to a pass where the hills were straight and steep on each hand, with pinnacled cliffs of a dark stone crumbling slowly into dust, and taking shapes of wild horror and strangeness, of demonry and satanery as they crumbled. There were faces in the stone, having the semblance of ghouls or goblins, that appeared to move and twist as the travelers went by. And Sir John and his companions were troubled by the aspect of these faces, and the similitudes which they bore to one another. So much alike indeed were many of them, that it seemed as if their first exemplars were preceding the wayfarers, to mock them anew at each turn. And aside from those which were like ghouls or goblins, there were others having the features of heathen idols, uncouth and hideous to behold, and others still that were like the worm-gnawed visages of the dead. And these also appeared to repeat themselves on every hand in a doubtful, arid, wildering fashion. For a time in the faintness that had come upon him, he saw not the things that were standing beside the way, nor the shrouded shapes that went by in funeral secrecy. Then, recovering his senses a little, he perceived that there were houses about him and the streets of a town, though these were but scantly to be discerned in the night that had fallen without bringing the stars. However, he saw, or deemed, that there were high mansions and broad thoroughfares and markets, and among them, as he went on, a building that bore the appearance of a great palace, with a facade that glimmered vaguely, and domes and turrets half swallowed up by the lowering darkness. As he neared the facade, Sir John saw that the glimmering came from within, and was cast obscurely through open doors, and between broad-spaced pillars. Too feeble was the light for torch or cresset, too dim for any lamp, and Sir John marveled amid his faintness and terror. But when he had drawn closer still, he saw that the strange gleaming was like the phosphor bred by the putrefaction of a charnel. Beneath the guidance of those who held him helpless, he entered the building. They led him through a stately ball, in whose carven columns and ornate furniture the opulence of kings was manifest. And thence he came into the great audience room, with a throne of gold and ebony set on a high dais, all of which was illumined by no other light than the glimmering of decay. And the throne was tenanted, nor by any human lord of Sultan, but a grey, prodigious creature, of height and bulk exceeding those of man, and having in all its overswollen form the exact similitude of a charnel worm. And the worm was alone, and except for the worm and Sir John and those beings who had brought him thither, the great chamber was empty as a mausoleum of old days, whose occupants were long since consumed by corruption. Then, standing there with a horror upon him as no man had ever envisaged, Sir John became aware that the worm was scrutinizing him severely, with little eyes deep folded in the obscene bloating of its face, and then, with a dreadful and solemn voice, it addressed him, saying, "I am king of Anchar, by virtue of having conquered and devoured the mortal ruler thereof, as well as all those who were his subjects. Know then that this land is mine, and that the intrusion of the living is unlawful and not readily to be condoned. The rashness and folly thou hast shown in thus coming here is verily most egregious, since thou wert warned by the people of Abaz, and warned anew by the jackal and the viper which thou didst meet on the road to Anchar. Thy temerity hath earned a condign punishment, and before I suffer thee to go hence, I decree that thou shalt lie for a term among the dead, and dwell as they dwell, in a dark sepulchre, and learn the manner of their abiding, and the things which none should behold with living eyes. Yea, still alive, it shall be thine to descend, and remain in the very midst of death and putrefaction, for such length of time as seemeth meet to correct thy folly and punish thy presumption." Sir John was one of the worthiest knights of Christendom, and his valor was beyond controversy. But when he heard the speech of the throned worm and the judgment that it passed upon him, his fear became so excessive that once again he was nigh to swooning. And still in this state, he was taken hence by those who had brought him to the audience room, and somewhere in the outer darkness, in a place of tombs and graves and cenotaphs beyond the dim town, he was flung into a deep sepulchre of stone, and the brazen door of the sepulchre was closed upon him. Lying there through the seasonless midnight, Sir John was companioned only by an unseen cadaver, and by those ministrants of decay who were not yet wholly done with their appointed task. Himself as one half dead, in the sore extremity of his horror and loathing, he could not tell if it were day or night in Anchar, and in all the term of endless hours that he lay there, he heard no sound other than the beating of his own heart, which soon became insufferably loud, and oppressed him like the noise and tumult of a great throng. Appalled by the clamor of his heart, and affrighted by the thing which lay in perpetual silence beside him, and whelmed by the awesomeness and dire necromancy of all that had befallen him, Sir John was prone to despair, and scant was his hope of returning from that imprisonment amid the dead, or of standing once more under the sun as a living man. It was his to learn the voidness of death, to share the abomination of desolation, and to comprehend the unutterable mysteries of corruption, and to do all this not as one who is a mere insensible cadaver, but with soul and body still inseparate. His flesh crept, and his spirit cringed within him, as he felt the crawling of worms that went avidly to the dwindling corpse or came away in glutted slowness. And it seemed to Sir John at that time, and at all times thereafter, that the condition of his sojourn in the tomb was verily to be accounted a worse thing than death. At last, when many hours or days had gone over him, leaving the tomb's darkness unchanged by the entrance of any beam or the departure of any shadow, Sir John was aware of a sullen clangor, and knew that the brazen door had been opened. And now, for the first time, by the dimness of twilight that had entered the tomb, he saw in all its piteousness and repulsion the thing with which he had abode so long. In the sickness that fell upon him at this sight, he was haled forth from the sepulchre by those who had thrust him therein, and fainting once more with the terror of their touch, and shrinking from their gigantic shadowy stature in cerements whose black folds revealed no human visage or form, he was led through Anchar along the road whereby he had come into that dolorous realm. His guides were silent as before, and the gloom which lay upon the land was even as when he had entered it, and was like the umbrage of some eternal occultation. But at length, in the very place where he had been taken captive, he was left to retrace his own way and to fare alone through the land of ruinous gardens, toward the defile of the crumbling rocks. Weak though he was from his confinement, and all bemazed with the things which had befallen him, he followed the road till the darkness lightened once more, and he came forth from its penumbral shadow beneath a pale sun. And somewhere in the waste he met his charger, wandering through the sunken fields that were covered up by the sand. And he mounted the charger and rode hastily away from Anchar through the pass of the strange boulders, with mocking forms and faces. And after a time he came once more to the northern road by which travelers commonly went to Georgia, and he was rejoined by the two Armenians, who had waited on the confines of Anchar, praying for his secure deliverance. Long afterwards, when he had returned from his wayfaring in the east and among the peoples of remote isles, he told of the kingdom of Abaz in the book that related to his travels, and also he wrote the reign concerning the province of Hanason. But he made no mention of Anchar, that kingdom of darkness and decay, ruled by the throned worm.